Hello and welcome to the Tournament Center here at PAX during the World Championships. And I'm here with Brian David Marshall, here with Scott-Vargas, and we're going to talk through the Modern Masters 2015 draft archetypes. We saw people drafting. We talked a lot about black-white spirits. We talked about affinity. We talked about blue-white skies, etc. But let's actually look at some of the successful deck archetypes. White-blue artifacts, we've been calling it affinity. Talk a little bit about this deck, Luis, and what you're trying to do when you're drafting it.
What you're really trying to do is leverage powerful cards like Cumulox, Lodestone Mirror, and cards like Frogmite, Mirror Enforcer, and Court Homunculus to attack your opponent pretty quickly and evasively. You like flyers, cards like Fairy Mechanist that get enhanced by Cranial Plating. Really the main thing is getting a critical mass of artifacts. You see Metalcraft and Affinity are both cards that are mechanics that reward you for that. And talking to all the players who drafted it, because actually we have a lot of players drafting it. In fact, one of the tables had 3.
Oh, wow.
You're able to, have to fight to get this critical mass, and a lot of those players, did not like that they didn't get, the 18 or 20 artifacts you really want.
I think you've spoiled some of them here, but let's talk about some of the common and uncommon kind of cards that are really key to drafting this. We saw Glinthawk Idol and Rested Relic. Talk about Blinding Soul Eater a little bit here.
It's funny, these 3 cards are the best attacking creature, the best big creature, and the best removal spell. Blinding Soul Eater is actually just a removal spell because it taps down whatever the best opposing creature is. Whether it's with life or mana, you're actually fine either way. And the fact that it bolsters your artifact count is another big bonus. So Blinding Soul Eater is one of the higher picks, especially because this is one of the 3 cards here that goes into other decks. You have the non-affinity decks interested in taking Blinding Soul Eater. So Glinthawk Idol, some people might want. Nobody's going to want Rested Relic unless they're drafting this deck, but Blinding Soul Eater goes in tons of decks.
Okay, let's keep looking at some of the uncommons now. This is Cranial Plating. We saw like a 5th pick Cranial Plating going to Mike Sigrist. That's a huge card, and probably like you said, a Christmas present that he was he was being rewarded for being in the right place at the right time.
Right. Cranial Plating is by far the best card in this archetype, and getting a Cranial Plating 5th is a huge sign. Especially pack 3, it's just like, well, I guess we're doing it. So Cranial Plating is one of the reasons to draft this deck. If you see a 3rd pick Cranial Plating pack 1, it's one of the reasons to go into it. Cards like Dispatch and Mirrorsmith do reward you for being in this deck. They're cards that no other decks can really play effectively, but Cranial Plating is really the thing you're looking for.
How about a card like Glassdust Hulk we see down there?
Glassdust Hulk is a nice, flexible card. The fact that it cycles for 1 white or blue mana means that no matter what, you're actually pretty happy like just cycling it or playing it and attacking for a bunch of damage.
Okay, so moving on, we get White-Black Spirit. So when we watched Mike Sigrist draft, he opened up a Midnight Banshee and could have gone into a White-Black Spirits deck, but got out of it pretty quickly. What do you want to do with this deck? Like, where would he have gone had he drafted that?
Yeah, like it mentions here, playing a long game and being very grindy is really what this deck's looking to do. The Soul Shift mechanic, when a creature dies, you get a spirit back that costs less than that or lower.
So that's a card like Scuttling Death.
Right. Scuttling Death has Soul Shift 4, gets back a 4 casting cost or less spirit from a graveyard when it dies. You're really looking to play these games where you're just like trading off cards, you're casting Nameless Inversion on their creatures. Nameless Inversion is one of the best cards actually in the deck, and not to spoil things, but Paulo's got a couple Nameless Inversions in his Black-White Spirit deck, and he's very happy with it. Part of the reason he won round 1, I assume. So you're really looking to trade cards and then finish them off with either incremental damage, like Ghost Council, of course, if you're lucky to have that rare, but Thief of Hope just drains them for 1 every time you cast a Spirit or Arcane card.
I'm a big Devouring Greed person, to the surprise of no one.
That's that's less an incremental damage source than just take 10.
Yeah, the Black Fireball.
Yeah, and Devouring Greed is a very good way to finish games.
So let's take a look at some of the commons that make this deck tick. You've named all of them already. Nameless Inversion, Thief of Hope, Waxmane Baku just lets you kind of control the board and
Waxmane
rush
Baku
through.
is great. It's in a lot of the games, it's just going to play a defensive measure. You can get about 1 counter per turn because every time you're casting a spirit, and then it holds off their 4/4 flyer for 5 turns. Or you just stack up the counters, tap their whole team, and just Alpha Strike and kill them in 1 hit. And that can happen. Both of those things can happen in the same game, and that's part of the reason Waxmane Baku is so powerful in this deck.
You talk about Soul Shift. You see Soul Shift 2 on the Thief of Hope can be really frustrating to trade 2 drops early, and then they get it back when you kill their Thief of Hope, or sometimes they get back, like you were saying earlier, Nameless Inversion,
right?
Which is just
brutal. Part of the strength of Nameless Inversion is that it's a removal spell that any black deck would be happy to play, 2 mana for 3 damage essentially, but it triggers Thief of Hope when you cast it, and it gets Thief of Hope back. when it dies, which is just a huge synergy.
Yeah. All right. So moving on, let's look at some of the uncommons here. We saw Hakari Twilight Guardian get selected. We didn't see a Restless Apparition or a Spectral Procession, but those are big cards that kind of open on and maybe think about going into Spirits.
Those really reward you for having lots of planes in your deck more than having Spirits, just because they're both such powerful cards. Right. But you're happy with those in Spirit decks as well.
Okay. Keeping the train moving here. Let's take a look at the Double Strike Equipment deck. Let's just take a look at some of the commons while you talk about that deck.
Right, and this is one of the least linear decks because, yes, you're trying to, compare equipment and double strikers and brute forces and all that, but you're really just a red-white beatdown deck. And if you have a good curve and a couple of removal spells like Burst Lightning, then you do a pretty good job of attacking your opponent.
And some of the uncommons that make this deck tick, Darksteel Axe, a huge card, Heathfire Goblin, and Boris Swiftblade.
And again, like Spectral Procession, Hearthfire Hobgoblin is just good if you can cast it. So if you're red-white, you just want this card in your deck,
right.
even
Double
if you don't have any combos with
fine.
it. Yeah, it's just a great card.
Okay, so keep going on to some of the archetypes. Green, White, Convoke. This is a deck I feel like most people want to draft when they sit down at the table. They would like to be this deck. Is that a fair statement?
I think this is the best deck in the format. I know that when I go into a draft, I hope to draft this deck. And a big part of that is that it's just got really powerful synergies, Scatter to Seeds plus cards like Fortifier or Overwhelm, and just a very reliable game plan, and you just flood the board. You can get some really good draws with this deck.
Yeah, I always feel like whenever my opponent's in a position to cast Fortify, that I'm just doomed in this format. Let's take a look at some of those commons that make the deck function. Kozilek Predator, card we saw drafted pretty early by Shahar Shenhar, Scion of the Wild, Raise the Alarm, and of course you said Scatter the Seeds. Right,
you have two cards that make tokens and a card that pays you for tokens, and that's really what this deck's about. It's just ways to make tokens and ways to get a payoff.
Okay. And what are the good uncommons here? Bestial Menace, more tokens. Spectral Procession, more tokens.
I mean, you're going to see Spectral Procession show up in almost every deck that can cast it. It's just such a great card. But Celestia Guildmage is the real standout here.
Okay. All right. Moving along. We get Blue-Black Proliferate. We talked about there being a blue-black control deck out on the floor. What are Midnight Banshees, a fine card for that. Right. Maybe even better than Black-White Spirit sometimes, just because
it does fit the game plan better. And in general, I found that this is the archetype I go into the least, just because it's hard to actually get your game plan going.
Let's take a look at some of the commons here that make this deck good. And what are you seeing? Aether Snipe, Nameless Inversion, again, another card that's going to show up in every deck that can cast it, right?
And Grim Affliction, these are all just good cards. And that's part of the problem I have with this deck, is that it's just a pile of good cards, which sometimes works.
Let's look at some of those good uncommons. Agony Warp, Dimir Guildmage.
Good card.
And let's just go quickly through the last of Blue-Red Elementals. This is a deck I always want to be in.
It's basically just Smoke Braider or bust. You're just trying to cast a bunch of elementals with a Smoke Braider.
Okay, let's take a look real quick. Burst Lightning, Aether Snipe, Smoke Braider, the uncommons, Electrolyte, Mull Drifter. That was such a late gift
Mull Drifter
for
is
Shahar.
just one of the best cards in any deck, and it's the best in this deck of all the decks.
I do love an incandescent spell. So then you see Blue-Green Graft. Let's just scroll through here really quickly. Spider, Narcolepsy.
And this is, again, a deck that is just kind of like a bunch of good cards, except when they all combine, they do slightly better.
Right. And then the uncommons, Coatl, the Cytoplast Rootkin, Frogling, all cards we saw get drafted. And then Black-Red Bloodthirst. Is this a deck you ever want to be in?
I prefer not to be drafting this deck, but I think it is a very solid deck. We've seen a number of players draft it today because if you have a good curve and you just curve Dusk Hunter Bat into Gorehorn Minotaurs, then you just have a pretty big offensive threat, and it's fast enough that it can take advantage of a slow start.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the commons here that make that work. Again, you see
the standout commons are just going to be in all the decks that are of those colors.
They tend to just be good cards and not necessarily linear cards. Blood Ogre and Gorehorn Minotaur, both cards you mentioned, but you need something like a Dusk Hunter Bat to make that work, or a Fire Slinger or something.
Yeah, you would prefer that. Otherwise, cards like Blood Ogre really just don't pull their weight.
Sure. And then uncommons. How good is Vampire Outcasts?
Well, it depends. How big is Vampire Outcasts?
let's just say for argument's sake, it's a 4/4.
If it's a 4/4, like 2/3 of the time, it's a great card. If it's a 4/4, a third of the time, or a quarter of the time, it's not a very good card. So that your deck just has to be built where it's going to be a 4/4 most of the times you draw it.
Yeah, Stormblood Berserker, and then so Black-Green Sacrifice. This was something people were talking about during the draft. The guys in the booth were really high on the deck. What does this deck look like?
This is basically the fallback plan for white-green tokens, I've found, because a lot of the cards that are good in the tokens deck overlap with cards that are good in the sacrifice deck. So if you don't end up in white-green tokens, you often will end up in black-green tokens. I would just call them both tokens because they're really token-based decks.
But you're kind of like trying to get your tokens to like an Eldrazi or something.
You're less getting paid off with cards like Fortify that pump all your team, and more getting paid off with cards like Necrogenesis, Culling Dias. Like these are cards that help you grind through. Scavenger Drake, Algae Gariel are both very good in this deck.
Let's take a look at some of the comments here. Again.
Okay, yeah, all tokens.
Right. So you started out as a green-white tokens deck.
Right.
It didn't work out. And then what are the cards on the uncommon side that kind of maybe forced you in, something like a reassembling skeleton or a scavenger drake? And then Algae Gariel, probably one of the most underrated cards in the format.
Yeah, it might not be anymore because everyone talks about how good it is, but this is definitely the best card in this deck.
All right, and then red-green domain. It's kind of, this is the 5-color.
5-color red. No, it's really 5-color green. And really what you're trying to do is combine Rampant Growth and Wayfarer's Bauble with just any good card you can get your hands on. You're just grabbing from here. Like, as long as you're getting powerful cards, the deck tends to work out pretty well. Assuming you have enough fixing, like, Wayfarer's Bauble and Rampant Growth.
Is this a deck you go into, or is it a deck you end up in when maybe your linear kind of, affinity deck or other deck that doesn't quite pan out, and then you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to pick up fixing here in this kind of middle spot, and then I'm going to just play whatever cards I can grab.
It really depends on what you open. If you open Comet Storm or Elish Norn or Hellkite Charger, one of these like really powerful, expensive cards, you tend to want to be in this deck.
Okay, so let's take a look at some of the uncommons here again. all good cards we've seen before.
In this case, Kozilek's Predator and Nest Invader are used more for the mana ramp side than they are for the actual token side, but both are quite good in the deck.
Yeah. The uncommons, Savage Twister.
That's actually one of the biggest reasons to go into the deck as well, because this is the best deck for Savage Twister by a lot.
Yeah, and if you're base green, you don't need a lot of red to support it. You can just
this deck, it's red-green, but it really is green with just whatever colors are good.
Right, and Pelakka Worm is your sort of save me.
Yeah,
Pelakka
Worm is a great card in the deck.
Okay, and so there you have it. That's the 10 draft archetypes for Modern Masters. Modern Masters is on, we've been drafting it online. It's fun, and we're watching these guys, and we're going to go and watch a couple more rounds of Modern Masters draft. Don't go anywhere.